Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. So this video is about the Whig view of history. Now, I suspect that I made a similar video a year or two ago, but I might be deluding myself. At my age, the memory fails. So I'm going to tell you what the Whig view of history is and some of the criticisms that have been made about the Whig view of history. So this is an intellectual tradition, and it seems to be a faith, not of a supernatural kind. Those who subscribe to this view, they reject the notion that things are changeless or unchanging or should be, because there were some Tories looking here, the British Isles. There were Whigs and Tories from the 17th century until the early 19th century. Those were the two political schools of thought. There were a few others like radicals. But some of the Tories were non-progressive and thought that things shouldn't progress, that at some level things never did progress, whether you wanted them to or not, because human nature is immutable. And the Tories developed into the Conservatives. Now, not just the Conservatives as a political party, Conservative with a small c to mean a traditionalist. So the major opposition to the Tories, to the Whigs, as I said, were the Tories, and they believed that if you remove certain social constraints, man is the beast unbound. I suppose it's this from the Romantic era, the late 19th century into the early 18th century. There's this debate about revolution and so on, and nature and civilization. The best paradigm is to say, well, should we have a garden or a wilderness? The radical preferring the wilderness. Well, Whigs aren't quite like that. They're not actual radicals or revolutionaries. But the Whigs would say they wanted ordered liberty. So the Whigs were a political party, and the word Whig was first used in a political sense way back in the 1730s, if I've got that right. 1630s, if I've got that right, in Scotland, a debate in the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. Incidentally, I have this problem with numbers, you might have noticed, of constantly saying the wrong number, having to correct myself. The other day I was looking for number 83 in a certain street, and then I tell myself it was number 50. How on earth did I do that? The digits 8 and 3, neither of those are in 50, but there we are. Anyway, so, and the Whigs, they disappeared as a political party really in the 1850s when the Liberal Party came about. And it's perhaps surprising the way, once the Liberal Party was founded, that the word Whig really dropped out of usage. It was only used retrospectively, looking back at the Whig Party, which was no more. Whereas the Conservative Party today, people use the word Tory about it as a nickname. It is not offensive to Conservatives, but it's not the official name. So, let me see. So the Whigs were all into parliamentarianism. And the word Whig, of course, was a term of abuse initially. It means horse thief in Scotland. And in England, there was some prejudice against the North British, which is one of the reasons that it was used. In 1681, there was the Oxford Parliament, as in Charles II. It was within the royal gift to summon Parliament to gather wherever it was the King's pleasure, and he chose that they should meet at Oxford, not in London. So they did. And they debated the exclusion bill. That's to say, the excluders wished to exclude James II from succession to the crown, and because Charles II had 20 children. The only trouble is none of them were with his wife, Catherine of Braganza. They were all with his various mistresses, and of course, because they were born outside of holy matrimony, they were thereby disbarred from succession to the crown. But James II had converted to Catholicism, and the excluders wished to exclude him on this basis. There was very strong anti-Catholic prejudice in Great Britain at the time. In Ireland, most of us were Catholics, but the Protestant minority were often prejudiced against us. And there were the abhorrers in that Parliament of England and Wales saying, we abhor the idea of excluding a prince of the blood royal from succession to the crown. Doesn't matter whether he's a Catholic or not. And that was that. So although the bill was passed, Charles II said no, absolutely no, and he used the strong arm who refused to sign, and they backed down. They didn't want to provoke another civil war. Anyway, and so the appropriate term for the abhorrers was Tory, as in the Irish word teora, meaning pursuer, literally. That was like brigand, an armed robber on horseback or a footpad. So Whig and Tory started that way. So there was this ongoing, tussle between the two for, my goodness, not that long, really, about 150 years, until they emerged into conservatives and liberals. It's a bit more complicated, a faction of this party splitting off and merging with that party, and another faction of this party breaking away and then amalgamating with the other lot. So, but the Whigs believed in parliamentarianism, so Parliament should exist, Parliament should be sovereign, and so forth. I could cite to you Walter Bagehot's book, The English Constitution, of the mid-19th century, a work of authority considered to be part of the United Kingdom's constitution nowadays, even though he called it the English Constitution, not the British Constitution, in which he said Parliament is omnipotent in all things except the power to destroy its own omnipotence, and things like that, and said what the monarchy's rights, the right to be informed, the right to warn, and so forth, but couldn't veto things. Anyway, this is a work of authority. Said who? There was no act of Parliament to say this is part of the UK Constitution, which is so amorphous, so vague. Anyway, Whigs, they would say that they are guided by reason. They're not hidebound by tradition, which is an accusation they often and vehemently threw at their opponents. And, the Tories, they hurled back some branding reproaches, such as the Whigs had intellectual pretensions, that they were too sympathetic towards dissenters, this being a time when those who were allowed into politics belonged to the church as by law established. In Scotland, the Church of Scotland; in Ireland, the Church of Ireland; in England, the Church of England; and in Wales, the Church of England. It wasn't called the Church of Wales. The Whigs, they were hostile to absolute monarchy. They despised despotism and so forth. You might say, well, yeah, big wows. Everybody loathes despotism. Not so in the 17th century, the 18th century, where really that was the norm. There was a monarch, he could rule by fiat, the divine right of kings, that was widely accepted, well, certainly by monarchs, in France, in Spain, in many of the minor German states, in Austria, Hungary, and so forth. Legislatures, insofar as they existed, were largely rubber stamps. So what was the old Latin tag? Voluntas regis lex suprema est. So Wilhelm II, the Kaiser of Germany, he wrote that in the golden book of a particular city he visited. They had this golden book for most estimable visitors to sign, and that was his comment. The will of the king of the supreme law. It was obviously a bastardization of that Latin tag. I can't remember who came up with it. Salus populi lex suprema est, as in the well-being of the people is the supreme law. But that's the kind of thing that Whigs would be against as well, because that suggests that civil liberties can be cast aside if you claim that it somehow is in furtherance of public safety. So more about Whigs and their view of history. So yeah, they would say there has to be organised freedom. They believe in liberty. That doesn't mean license or libertarianism. I'm not saying you can do absolutely anything you want. They have to have some public morals, and we have to have some public control, some regulation. They accept certainly the emergency services, and therefore we've got a tax to pay for those. And we have to have a legislature that has got to be paid for, and courts and prisons and all the rest of it. But the state should be loath to interfere. The Tories would agree that somewhat. Now, to begin with, there might seem to be very little difference between them. Obviously, this was not an era of mass politics. The 17th century, the 18th, or even the early 19th century, there was a very small number of lettered people, and those who owned a significant amount of real property, and they had the franchise. It was very complicated. You can see by the video about the right to vote in the British Isles. What else would I say about Whigs and Tories? So the people who got into politics could only be upper class or upper middle class. The great majority were excluded from the right to vote, and all but a tiny minority were excluded even from the right to stand for parliament, because in order to stand for parliament, one had to prove that one owned a huge amount of realty. So the Whigs, they had a mechanistic view of the state. Certainly this became very evident by the time of 1832, the Representation of the People Act, or the Great Reform Act as it's commonly called, to say that the state is as it were, mechanical. It is man-made. It's not divinely ordained. And if a bit of it is rusty, we could remove it and repair it, replace it, things like that. The whole thing won't die. Whereas this Tory notion that the state was an organism, if you will, and you to take a organ out of a living being, that being will die. Even if that organ is diseased, you mustn't remove it because the whole thing will die. That was their analogy. So obviously this being an era before organ transplants became viable. So the Whigs, well, there's a lot along with their view of history, and I suppose I'll come into their projection about what was going to happen and their belief about how things had happened. So they believed in meliorism to an extent, that things were improving, and that was desirable. They believed that power ought to be diffused, there ought to be the different branches of government, and that's not something that's original to the American Revolution. Forgive me, I don't recall which 17th century British political philosopher came up with that one, that the power must be, of the different branches of government, the three different branches, the legislative, the executive, the judicial branch, must be limited. And they all had their appointed limits that were constrained, and they mustn't stray into each other's territory. They were a check on each other, as indeed the two parties were a check on each other. Remembering that the Tory and the Whig party, until the early 19th century, had no official existence. There was no law against parties existing, but nobody actually set up some sort of legal entity called the Whig party, the Tory party. There was no official list. You didn't pay to be a member. There was no credo published of what their beliefs and policies were. There was no official list. You were a Tory if you called yourself a Tory. You were a Whig if you called yourself a Whig. There were no official publications about these things. It is only really from the 1830s that parties became formalised, the foundation of the Carlton Club for the Conservative Party, formerly the Tories. Well, there was the Liberal Club, the National Liberal Club, as there is for the Whigs. Now, I know there were private members' clubs like White's and the Reform Club, and a few others, Boodles, that were thought to be Whig or Tory, but they weren't explicitly political, but from the 1830s was spelt out. Anyway, so going back in time, so the Whigs would believe that they accepted the values of the Enlightenment, even though the Whig Party had emerged to some extent by the 1630s, as it would have been parliamentarians or Roundheads during the English Civil War. The so-called English Civil War was fought in Ireland, in Scotland and Wales. It was really only by the 1680s that the terms Whig and Tory are widely accepted in the political sense and become something which is a self-definition and not simply an opprobrious term. Now, despite the Enlightenment and all that, the Whigs, and indeed their Tory opponents, would support religious discrimination. I think it's hard to remember just how recently the notion of equality achieved broad acceptance, because our species has existed for over 3 million years, and it's only in the last 200 years that many people have thought, yeah, we should have equality because we were tribal beasts, and there's my in-group and there was an out-group, I don't trust them, or, I think that perceive them as a threat. We really lack the resources, the means of life, we've got to fight for those. That was, I suppose, the attitude. And then religion is part of that. Your myth-making, your stories, your lore, these sort of these rituals that you find reassuring, a part of your tradition, these folk tales, these propitiations that provides the bonds of a social network. And so anybody who's outside those, we just have to exclude, and they're going to make them suffer, because they would make us suffer if they could. I suppose that's the attitude wherever you are in the world. So the Whigs would definitely identify with Protestantism, want to discriminate against Catholics. Why? I suppose they'd say that we're irrational, or that we are adherents of a foreign power. Remembering the Pope, he was, of course, and is actually a secular leader. the head of state, and until the 1920s, certainly in his mind, ruled the Papal States, not just the city of Rome, a large chunk of central Italy, and there's a Swiss Guard now, but until the 19th century, it was a serious army. It was a formidable military force. I mean, the Metropolitan Guard, the Noble Guard, that's his cavalry regiment, the Pontifical Navy and so forth, in the early modern era. So they said, oh, you are, subjects effectively of a foreign potentate, the Bishop of Rome. They would have said papist, which we now regard as pejorative. And sometimes they advocated discrimination against dissenters, not a political dissident, someone who's a Protestant outside one of the established churches, as in being like a Methodist, for example, or a member of the Religious Society of Friends, that's a Quaker, as they're commonly called, a Baptist, and so forth. So that's what that they were into. So membership of the established church was necessary for full membership of the polity, as it were, because the church and state, they were hand in glove, as what's his name later wrote, James Joyce, although he's talking about Irish Catholicism. Okay, so the Whigs would say they're logical, although they are hero-based to an extent. They're emotive. They might not wish to recognise this. They have pretensions to intellectual rigour and objectivity, which are largely unwarranted if you look at their actual record. They're afflicted by a number of debilities. They are a fascinating example of motivated rationalism. So though they are rational to some degree, they are prejudiced a certain way. They have a slant. They feel they must reach a certain conclusion, and they have to bend the facts to fit that. So there's observer bias. You're looking at the situation, but surely that's your observations are slanted by the angle you're standing at. There's confirmation bias, seeking out information, which is likely to confirm their preconceptions. So there was this presumption amongst them that there was the embryo of parliamentary government in the British mind always, and in British political structures. So their historiography is very much prejudiced by contemporary debates. So if you're writing Whig history in the 1820s, you're refracting things through the prism of the 1820s. If you look at the Middle Ages, and you're trying to score points against your adversaries in the 1820s by looking back to historical examples. They were constantly conscripting past protagonists into present political disputes, and that's one of the accusations laid at their door is presentism, which is obviously a crime if you're a historian. Anyway, so it's very much nunc pro tunc, as in now for then. So they seek to retroactively recruit people and indeed forces for their current disputes. That's the problem with Whigs. They're so often actuated by current political preconceptions, and these occlude their judgment. I mean, the Whig history, well, I'm not sure anyone says they belong to the Whig school of history now, but you could probably see people today who are a bit like that, saying, well, I'm looking back to the 18th century, and I'm assuming that so-and-so was on my side, I'm a continuation of that tradition, and all the rest of it, and even if the truth doesn't quite work for me, I can twist it a bit, and it more or less works for me. So they're almost millenarian in feeling there's going to be an almighty showdown between the two good sides. It's almost like a battle between good and evil. It's rather redolent of Francis Fukuyama. If you don't recall, he's an American academic. About 1990, published a celebrated tome entitled The End of History and the Last Man, in which he said that really the American way was the apex of human development, and that was a model to which everyone is aspiring or should aspire. It's that sort of liberal democracy, capitalism, and the United States really is the best place on earth, and the others would do well to study the American example and indeed to emulate it. Well, if it seems decidedly triumphalistic, well, it is. Now, Fukuyama later ate his words, and he believed that democracy was very much good for export, and Iraq in 2003 was an ideal market. But within a couple of years, he was penitent, and he said, my goodness, the delusion, I just got it very badly wrong in my exuberance, for evangelizing for the cause, I forgot those principles of skepticism which inform a wise person. And he's, well, I don't know, is he liberal, is he conservative, kind of somewhere in between, maybe average in the American political spectrum. Anyway, the trouble with Whiggery is it's too self-referential. Well, one of the many problems with it. And you could even talk about American Whiggism today. Back at the time of the American Revolution, the word Tory was a term of abuse, as in, well, certainly if you were a revolutionary, for a loyalist, someone who still adhered to the British Crown. So the thing about Whigs is they desire to either exalt people or vilify people who were in past debates, and the Whigs would try and liken their disputants to tyrants of bygone centuries. And the Whigs would suggest that people of previous centuries subscribe to current political mores. So I think these are some of their delusions. There was this assumption on the part of the Whigs of the inescapability of progress. They believed that things were bound to happen. It's almost as though there was predestination. I wonder if even subliminally it's linked to Protestantism, because they were Protestants almost without exception. And the 17th and 18th century, the notion of predestination, you're either going to the celestial regions or to the infernal ones, that was decided before time began. So it's almost as though the Whigs thought that history was pre-programmed to set off like a time bomb. It's going to go off at a certain moment. It's a bit like Marxists believe that. I remember that old gag about Marxist historians, the future is certain as the past is always changing, when they had to manipulate the past to fit the current political needs. So the Whigs believe that society could be remade, that there is evolution, that they very much want to change, but it needs to be gradual. Anyway, so what values did they hold dear? They cherished habeas corpus and Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, and the last one was probably the Palladium of Liberty for them. So they regarded there as being a chain of causation in history, and they perceive patterns where they don't exist, thinking that history is a perpetual battle between liberty and tyranny, and they're on the side of liberty, but they think that's parliamentary government, certainly the right to vote for the propertied classes, and that's crucial. It's for a small minority, not for the broad mass, and I'll explain why a little bit later. So there was this presupposition that the British way was the best way, indeed the only way in the long run, and you'll notice that's transmogrified into American thinking a lot these days. So the Whigs tended to believe that constitutional monarchy was the acme of political achievement. You mustn't have republicanism. Well, they tried that. The British Isles tried that with Cromwell, and that's a military dictatorship. And that these people, they are not constrained by a constitution as much as a monarch is. And this military dictator, he will be destructive of liberty. So he can't possibly have that, because the monarchist is politically neutral. He or she occupies that certain square that people can't occupy, and people could say, God save the king and damn the government. So that's one of the reasons why they tended to be monarchists. Though they wanted the monarchy to be politically neutral, they didn't particularly mind, though, when the monarch was on their side. So there is a certain inconsistency there, which you may have noticed. So what else about the Whigs? So these men were brought up with a classical education, looking back to the ancient Mediterranean world, to Greece and Rome, and they drew many analogies between the ancient Mediterranean world and the era they were living through. So they thought Julius Caesar was a bad thing, whereas Brutus was a good egg. They'd sometimes have a bust of Brutus on their desk. The trouble is, people of a Whig outlook and in the continent often became what would the word be radicals and Republicans at the time, and they too would adulate Brutus, saying that, and actually Brutus and his co-conspirators, they were the liberatores, as they call themselves in Latin, and I don't think you need to understand Latin to be able to guess what liberatores means. Anyhow, so the Whigs, they thought that the British model could, broadly speaking, be emulated by all if certain conditions were met with regard to education. they thought that these Whig nostra were not immediately applicable to other countries, and thought that Tories were bad, or maybe too snobbish, too close-minded, too susceptible to authoritarianism, that there wasn't a huge amount to choose between if you're looking at Whigs and Tories. Though the political debate was very heated, it was full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, to quote the Bard of Avon. Anyway, at worst, Whiggism was overly polemical, it was crass, it contained a number of fallacies. They had a rather hackneyed view of historical figures. They were either good guys or bad guys. They rarely allowed for nuance or context. They were a bit moralistic. Anyway, it's a delicious irony that they fell victim to many of the self-delusions that they accused their opponents of. There was a lot of self-deception there. They were rather emotive, as they claimed they weren't. As they claimed the others were. They weren't always terribly logical. And there was too much giving themselves a pat on the back for the British way just being superior, and everybody should copy the Brits. Anyway, so at this juncture, I'll explain, what the Tories were into. The Tories were much more intellectually modest and were suspicious of grand theorising. And indeed, they would say they're profoundly sceptical of ideology. And they didn't think that history was really an eternal battle, as the Whigs did. If you go to Bowood House, for example, in England, there is a house of a grand Whig family, and you could walk past, it's owned by Lord Lansdowne, the Marquis of Lansdowne, walk past a series of statues in the garden of all these Whig icons, but they go back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, as I suggested earlier. As I said, like Julius Caesar making himself dictator for life, and Brutus saying, well, I've got to take him out, because he's going to subvert liberty. Remember, consuls in ancient Rome were supposed to be 2 at a time. A consul should serve for a year and then not serve again until another year had passed, had to leave office for a year. But Caesar served for, I think it was 12 consecutive years, made himself sole consul for life, dictator, had a coin struck with his image on it. Only gods had done that before. Remember, the ancient Romans believed in deification. But anyway, so the Whigs thought that Caesarism held this dangerous allure, and dim people, gullible people, could easily fall for it, especially if they're chauvinistic. Of course, the Whigs were actually chauvinistic too in their way. So Caesar and those of his ilk appealed to the lower orders, who were easily gulled by glib rhetoric, by military glory, by conquest, the subjugation of other peoples. So the Whigs say they would firmly resist these passing fans, these very transient glories, and instead uphold eternal liberty. Rabble-rousers must be firmly resisted, and it's difficult because people can get carried away with euphoria. Most people are so dim-witted and emotive. So we mustn't be sheeple. We mustn't simply follow the herd. Remember, the French in the mid-19th century talked about Césarisme populaire in relation to Napoleon III or Napoleon the Great, his uncle. The Latin Americans, they often name boys César, and they've had more than their fair share of sawdust Caesars in their time. So the Whig view of history is very much teleological. It believes that history is moving towards a goal. It's very Britocentric, and there were certainly in the 19th century, plenty of Whig historians like Sir James Mackintosh, Lord Thomas Babington Macaulay, who wrote a famous essay on Mackintosh. So you could dip into Macaulay's multi-volume History of England. I've read it myself, and it's often tumid and bombastic, paints a swelling scene. The prose would seem decidedly turgid by contemporary standards. It amused me to read about King Louis of France, Louis XVI mostly, and writing it as Louis, Lewis, so not accepting the English name Louis. Anyway, so he was an MP himself, Macaulay, for the Whig Party, should go without saying, but when it came to the Representation of the People Act, 1832, and he provided a vindication of that, but he said, reform that you may preserve, perhaps his most famous adage. is actually redolent of what Edmund Burke had said, my goodness, like 30 years earlier, or 40 years earlier, a society which is incapable of reforming itself is incapable of preserving itself. You need to update, you need to move with the times and face a new situation. You mustn't be stuck in a time warp and pretend that you're still living decades or centuries earlier. So that was that. So as many Tories were vehemently opposed to the Great Reform Act, and the Whigs, they were very divided in this. Most agreed to reform, but how much? Just a teensy bit, quite substantial, very significant. Okay, it was a very heated debate over that one. So what's the central thesis of his History of England, Macaulay? Because it's a very partisan one. One of the things he says is the 1688 revolution, or the Glorious Revolution, as we would not have been shy about calling it. He said that England had a preserving revolution in 1688, which meant it didn't need to have a destroying revolution in the 19th century. So it was they were reluctant revolutionaries. It's one book calls them those who overthrew King James II in 1688. Anyway, might seem like hogwash, really, because in fact very little change for most people. It was only for the very few had any voice in politics. Most people were just as poor and exploited after 1688 as they had been before. Freedom of expression was severely circumscribed by laws about sedition and blasphemy, and that was the case well into the 19th century. These supposed sacred liberties in the British Isles had been very much watered down in the 1790s into the 18 teens by various acts of Parliament, the Six Acts and so on, unduly broadening the definition of sedition to send radicals to the clink or all the way to Van Diemen's Land. Anyway, so Macaulay, who was involved with India, though he never went there, wrote a multi-volume history of India, but despite never setting foot there, he served in a number of cabinet posts. But there is his famous and perhaps infamous Minute on Education in India, and really he's perhaps one of the most significant educationalists with regard to India. Having said that, I'm not sure he ever taught a single lesson in his life. But this was a seminal moment, perhaps world historical, saying the language of instruction in India must no longer be Persian, it must be English. And that's the 1830s. And we're living with the consequences of that today and shall do for centuries into the future, for good or ill. So the importance of that is hard to overestimate, especially as India is the second most populous country in the world, may well be a superpower. But despite openly acknowledging he was not conversant in any Indian tongue or Persian, he said, well, I've spoken to those who can read them, and I've told that there's really nothing worthwhile written in those languages. A single shelf of any European library is worth far more than anything they could produce. And I seem to be incredibly conceited and self-satisfied about the English language, about the British Isles in general. Anyway, so he said we must set about Britannicizing the Indians, create a race which, whilst Indian in race and colour, is English in taste and manners, and that would fit them for self-government. So it's astonishing. In the 1830s, he's looking forward over 100 years. Obviously, we didn't know it was going to come in 1947, that India would become independent. And anyway, it happened. Thomas Carlyle, another Whig historian, you could call him, more of the late 19th century, very disobliging about us in Ireland, saying England is like an elephant confronted by a half-starved rat. What must this elephant do? Squelch it, by heavens, squelch it. Where do we stamped on? I don't see why. There was William Stubbs, who was the first Regius Professor of History at Oxford University. Now, Regius means like of the king, a royal professor. And is indeed under only him, after his time, that history could be studied as a distinct and separate subject in Oxford. He was an Anglican bishop. Remember, most Oxford dons were Anglican clergy. Until the 1870s, they almost all had to be, and well into the 20th century, lots of them were. And William Edward Hartpole Lecky, a professor at Trinity College Dublin, he had the same view. thought the Act of Union was wrong to pass in 1800 in Ireland, but we couldn't go back to that system because those who had held sway back then believed in honour and property, church, king and liberty, and one couldn't sort of go back in time, so had to preserve the union because now hoi polloi had the right to vote and so on. He's still honoured with a statue in Trinity, but if most Dubliners knew that today, they would want it removed. Sir George Trevelyan, take him. He's a Durham College named in his honour, Durham University College. But his grandfather was a civil servant who said some highly disobliging things about us, the Irish, during the famine, saying that it was some sort of divine retribution that so many of us starved. But anyway, he's a noted civil servant and Whig historian in the early 20th century, Sir George Trevelyan. So the Whigs, they were zealously partisan. You might think there was a lack of intellectual rigour there, and they let their emotions get the better of them. But they were critiqued by the mid-19th century, David Hume, his history, or Butterfield in the 20th century, saying that the whole lot was really hogwash. So David Hume had called it the Whig fallacy. But by the First World War, it was very much falling out of fashion. You could dip into continuity and anachronism by Blas, and he said that Whiggery was more or less dead by 1914, the outbreak of the First World War. People talk about the Edwardian crisis. It reminds me of this little ditty by the poet Thomas Hardy, which is entitled Christmas 1915. Peace on earth, we sing it, and pay 1,000,000 priests to bring it. After 2,000 years of mass, we've got as far as poison gas. Saying that there is no progress, that, well, certainly scientific progress just leads us to kill each other more efficiently. So some of the liberal objectives, home rule, the welfare state, temperance, electoral reform, free trade, these have been dealt with as far as the Liberal Party was willing to deal with them, and they didn't want to go. They didn't want to go too far. They just didn't believe in more change than they'd already effected. But then the Labour Party was overtaking them, winning over an increasing number of working class voters. So the Whigs, or the Liberals rather, their new name, they were eventually pushed out as the major second party by Labour. So the Whigs had believed that those who had a stake in the country, owning a lot of land of significant value, were the people who ought to be permitted to vote, and that men who owned a great deal of landed property should be eligible for election. Parliaments can make laws, can control money bills, scrutinise ministers and so on, hold the executive to account. And the system for electing people and the distribution of seats may not be perfect. Some minor changes might be a good idea, which was anathema to the Tories in the 18th century. So the Whigs still believe that a hereditary element in Parliament should be there, because peers are randomly selected, they're independent. The Whigs supported the monarchy, believing it was consistent with the system, but the monarchy must be limited and it must be strictly symbolic. So the Whigs, as I say, they believed in certain rights, the right to a fair trial, and they believed in freedom of expression and so on. So no one should be sent to prison without good reason. Nobody should be deprived of his property unless by lawful judgment handed down by a court. They believed in an independent judiciary, but they, as I say, when they wanted free speech, they didn't want license for blasphemy or treason. They didn't want a standing army without the consent of Parliament, because that could be used to bulldoze Parliament. A monarch could shut down Parliament and take away the people's liberty, as it happened in many other countries. They didn't like the idea of a police force because it appeared to be such an army. They thought that Catholics, or Roman Catholics as they would have called us, should be allowed into politics because the Catholic Church sanctifies tyranny. And the Catholics only get into Parliament in order to raise it to the ground. So they thought that Catholics will take away property rights and liberty. That would be oppressive and unthinkable. Likewise, the masses would do that. Only rich people don't have enough money to be independent. They can't be easily bribed, and a gentleman of leisure can devote his time to serving the public, and they're motivated by just a sense of duty. And so the Whigs, they don't care much for ignorami and paupers, so they think the best guarantee for the well-being of the lower orders is that the upper orders should rule. the leisured classes have sufficient time to engage in politics, to read pages of parliamentary debates, and to reflect on these serious issues, listen to these lengthy orations, and they should do so without pay. So the Whigs believed in checks and balances, saying that no one institution should be too powerful. It's a little bit like Lord Acton's dictum, and Lord Acton was a Whig historian. They were Catholic in the very late 19th century, saying power tends to corrupt, and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. Tends to. The word tends to is often left out when people cite that quotation. It goes back to, I think it's Aristotle's paradigm of the cloak. Imagine you had a cloak, and you could don this cloak and become invisible, and be certain that you could commit any crime you wanted and be sure that you would evade detection. Would you abuse it? Would you commit a crime? Would you steal something? Would you hit someone? Would you spy on someone? Whatever, get up to mischief, if you were sure you could never, ever be apprehended? Most people would do it. And that, he said, is why power must be limited, because a good cursed person can turn bad if he's subjected to these temptations, knowing that he can never be brought to book for it. Anyway, so the Whigs recognized that good people can turn bad, that wise people can turn mad or unwise. So we mustn't allow people to be carried away by wickedness and folly. And that's why they thought that the British unwritten constitution was the perfect balance between three elements: monarchy, aristocracy, and elected representation. So they thought that democracy was a bad concept. It had failed so abysmally in ancient Greece. It would give the vote to the swinish multitude, as Edward Burke termed the majority of people. So most people are pig ignorant. Anyway, in the 18th century, most people were illiterate. They were semi-civilized, they had bigoted opinions and so forth. They had no idea what was in their best interests. They would be easily led by a fork-tongued demagogue. They could be hoodwinked by a viperous politician's sweet talk into voting to abolish sacred rights, such as property. So therefore we had to watch out for those silver-tongued orators, and people could be easily stampeded by fear into abolishing civil liberties, to getting rid of the right to trial, and so on. So most people were unlettered and could easily be made to believe in a false religion or something like that. They would call for barbaric things to be done. The crowd is overly emotional and is never rational. So that would be tyranny. So the foolish and poor might actually do well out of tyranny. They might prefer to get rid of liberty. They would easily fall for the splendor of a military dictator. So that's why we mustn't allow this vile mob to vote. They shouldn't be allowed to participate in politics at all. Strong order needs to be maintained against the mob, but not so strong that it turns into tyranny. So politicians were regularly badgered, spat at, covered with mud, beaten up by baying mobs. So as long as they weren't actually killed, their windows were smashed. And that was a price that politicians were willing to pay for living in a free society. And many people might exchange the right to vote for the right to verbally, to beat up politicians now. But in the 18th century, looking at the working class, you can see where the Whigs took this view. The mob turned out to enjoy a good old branding or flogging or hanging or switching off. No long drop out like a light. No. They would dance. The people being hanged, they'd be kicking their legs like mad for 20 minutes as they strangled. The people went to hare coursings, badger baitings, and so on, bear baitings, plenty of blood. That was popular entertainment. They paid to go to mad houses, see the poor, wretched lunatics chained up, being tormented and goaded, as we'd pay to go to the zoo these days. The poor got drunk on gin. There was no tax on this till the late 18th century. People much dirtier than the rich. They had so few clothes. They went barefoot. They seldom had the chance to wash. They often had no teeth, little fuel for heating their water. So it wasn't their fault they were ragged. They were the lumpen proletariat. So many members of the middle class and the upper classes enjoyed some of the same barbaric activities that the lower orders engaged in. Anyway, not all of the lower orders behaved in this disreputable manner that the Whigs used to suggest that the proletariat and the peasantry ought to be excluded from the right to vote because of them engaging in these ghastly activities. The poor were less likely to go to church than the wealthy. The church was obviously seen as the font of all goodness and morality, and a respectable person to be a weekly worshipper. The rich had these pews reserved for them. They could afford Sunday best. The poor had only just one suit. So anyway, established churches appear to care little for the lower orders, indeed to scorn them for their venality, their drunkenness, their vulgarity. But anyway, the nonconformists came along, those Protestants outside the established churches, the Baptists, the Quakers, the Methodists, and so forth. They reached out to the working class. I remember the Lord Salisbury, a Conservative Prime Minister in the late 19th century, said that the working class were all about vulgarism, lasciviousness, and inebriation. So he was a Victorian Titan. But for many 18th century Whigs, they would have agreed with him. They would have been of one mind with him on this one. Remember, Lord Salisbury, he deprecated the Daily Mail as being written by office boys for office boys, but he didn't mind his readers voting for him because of their hurrah patriotism, their jingoism, just the kind of moronic bile, demagoguery that the Whigs deprecated. Anyway, Salisbury, he denounced socialism as a creed beyond the pale of human tolerance. So the Whigs believed that tyranny could happen when parliamentary government was done away with, and arbitrary rule was introduced. A tyrant hates a free speech and trial by jury, and they hate freedom of worship for sensible denominations. What's sensible? Well, that's a moot point. The tyrants wish to concentrate all power in their own hands to nullify rights, and monarchs are not great, but they're better than the alternative, which could be a total breakdown of law and order, or indeed the rise of a despot like Cromwell. It is far better to have the limited influence of a constitutional monarchy than it is to have an absolute monarch, whether monarchical or republican. It's better the devil you know. So that's why the Whigs said, well, let's be run by representative institutions. Well, they weren't that representative of the ordinary people. Anyway, this is the Whig view of history, how politics should be, and the goal they're moving towards. Obviously, in the late 19th century, some of the more advanced Whigs thought that, quite a lot of reform was in order. Charles James Fox, but he was by no means the most radical. Obviously, the logical endpoint of this is the vote for all adults. The 18th century, well, almost nobody apart from Mary Wollstonecraft is talking about women having the right to vote. Read her Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Anyway, so they believe that history shows that there's gradual progress in parliamentary government. None of the 18th century would have accepted that, I think, votes for all adults was the logical endpoint of this. You can widen the franchise, but not too much, because this would open the door to democracy, and in the 18th century, many thought that was disastrous. Democracy was a boo word, and that would lead to the absolute downfall of civilization. Most people are far too moronic and prejudiced to be permitted to say in how they're governed. So the affluent must make decisions on behalf of the lower orders. Trades unions must not be allowed by the Combination Acts, because the trades unions would infringe on the rights of the property owners. What about the rights of the propertyless? Well, they don't count. Yes, they are ignorant, but because they're denied an education, because they have to work since the day they can walk, and they live in such poverty they can't afford books or anything. The Whig politicians didn't appear to take account of this. So anyway, but if you open the door too much, the franchise to too many people, that's the first step down the slippery slope to mob rule. Property is inviolable. We mustn't get it wrong with that. Now, obviously, a lot of this is bunkum because many of these Whigs supported slavery. Some Tories were against it. What about the rights of the black people you abducted in West Africa? Anyway, so the Whigs thought that the benighted masses must not be admitted to the pale of the Constitution. This is rather akin to modern liberals and their view of the independence of the judiciary. Democracy must not apply to judicial decisions. These decisions are not to be made by majority decision because the public are too punitive, too passionate, too bigoted. They're not sufficiently well informed. And so Whigs would have said that about, ordinary men and voting. They're not well clued up. They have no idea what decision they're making. And so, as they say, that an uninformed choice is no choice at all. Anyway, the public are ignorant, so they mustn't be permitted to say on political affairs. That's the way it is with the working class of voters. That was the Whig view in the 17th century into the 18th century. There are matters of which the public know little and they care even less. Therefore, they don't need to be consulted. It would be singularly inappropriate to grant the franchise to the masses. That was the Whig view at the time, and the Tories would have agreed with them on this one, and the Tories would have been probably even more adamantly opposed to widening the franchise. So the Whig Weltanschauung can be described as mostly self-serving cant. They believe that only men of considerable consequence in this world should be allowed to vote, and they believed there should be the right to freedom of expression so long as you don't disagree with us too significantly, because that would be sedition. So that's hardly free expression at all. So anyway, they said things that they dislike are just uncivilized, and therefore they don't bear consideration at all. Anyway, the Whigs believed in evangelizing for their principles abroad, supporting Protestantism and parliamentary government, which they thought went together. They believed in maintaining the established churches, but not mistreating other Protestants too much. Those nonconformists, we call them, or dissenters, as in Protestants outside the established church. They remember in Scotland there's the Episcopalian Church, which theologically is similar to the Church of England, but is not in the same position as the Church of England. The Church of Scotland, which is theologically Presbyterian, was obviously theologically aligned with Presbyterians in England. So the Whigs welcomed the Enlightenment, but they were chary about the views of some of the more advanced advocates thereof, those who doubted Christianity and monarchy, those who wanted to significantly reorder society. But anyway, generally speaking, the Whigs were pleased with a rational reappraisal of government that seemed to be laudable. The Whigs especially thought this reflected credit on the British system and discredit on the French, and they're in favour of that. I remember in the mid-19th century they were more aggressive than the Tories, keener than the Tories to fight other countries. So the Whigs believed that they were humane, they were relatively open-minded, and they saw no contradiction between that and punishments which we would regard as monstrous these days, such as whipping for quite minor offences, mutilating people, and the death penalty for offences as trifling as grand larceny. So some of the Whigs would have believed that whites were superior to other races, and that the British were superior to other nationalities in Europe. All this is obviously grossly immoral, but these are the kind of things that many Whigs in the 18th century would not have looked askance at. And they also believe that women shouldn't be right at any political rights. So their liberalism, from a modern perspective, was highly relative, but it was liberal by the standards of the 18th century. But in the late 18th century, the Whigs were beginning to look more favourably on the idea of political reform, granting more propertied men the right to vote. So making the vote a bit more consistent between different boroughs and shires, representation not so unequal. So most of them agreeing to at least very limited reform. And those who wanted very rapid and sweeping reform were known as radicals, and the radicali split off from the Whigs eventually. The Whigs generally agreed with the radical on the overall principle there's got to be some sort of reform. So radicals then expressed their opinions very freely. The Tories did not hold to this. Anyway, so the Whigs' view of history was denounced as drivel from the start by Tories such as David Hume, that Scottish philosopher spoke of the Whig fallacy. So the Tories often had sympathy for Charles I, the Cavaliers in the English Civil War, and even James II. So Tories actually, as the 1830s, they thought Oliver Cromwell was evil. They thought the country was no freer after 1688 than it had been before. Despite that, some Tories had been for the 1688 revolution. So the Tories saw the nation as an animal and not a machine, and that's perhaps the key distinction. So the Tories were profoundly suspicious of the least reform. They weren't absolutely opposed to reform. Some of the more broad-minded Tories would agree to some very trifling reform. So they told themselves that the British Constitution was the envy of the world, that everyone else used to copy it. Other countries would do well to study the UK Constitution. They believed that the UK had an excellent balance between monarchy, aristocracy, and an elective element, but they would lean more towards the monarchy, whereas Charles James Fox famously propounded that motion that the influence of the crown has been increased and ought to be diminished. So the Tories did not presume to lecture other countries on how to run their internal affairs. They believed in things being natural, certain rights being natural to the British Isles, and other rights in other systems being natural to a different country. We're different species, more or less, according to them. So nationality was everything. So the Tories believed that the British did things in a distinctively British way, and the French did things in a French way, and that was that, and there the twain shall meet. The Tories were more pragmatic in foreign policy. They're willing to team up with countries run by absolute rulers, by Roman Catholics, and so on. Remember, Protestants in the 18th century often said Roman Catholic and not just Catholic, because the head of the Catholic Church lives in Rome. The Tories strongly believed in upholding the paramountcy of the established churches, perhaps even more so than the Whigs, and the Tories approved of discriminating against dissenters. So a few Tories felt that Catholics ought to be allowed equality. But anyway, no popery was a potent slogan for both. Anyway, the Tories, as I say, they view the state as a living thing. The Whigs recognise it's man-made. Even the Tories had to admit sometimes the British state was not flawless, but they thought it was nothing ever is, and people are not perfectible. But they said it was best not to tamper with the British state. It was a house of cards. If you remove one, the whole thing will come crashing down around your head. The Tories regarded themselves as being a party of altar and throne. It's like Lord Eldon, that famous judge, a guy I went to uni with actually, my old college. He was a very senior jurist under King George III, and he said the established church must be maintained, not to make the church political, but the state religious. I remember in the early 19th century, the Earl of Eldon, in some case he said he accused the defendant of seeking to establish a representative government, in other words, the opposite of that which prevails here, which might seem to be shocking that he wanted such an unrepresentative government. So the Tories are very strong believers in monarchy. They felt the crown should retain a great deal of influence. They believed that overthrowing a monarch was the worst thing you could possibly do. But they often supported the idea of putting deposed monarchs back on their thrones, including despots abroad. So both parties were deeply suspicious of excessive interference in general. They believed that the state needed an overwhelming reason in order to intrude into someone's house or personal affairs. Alcoholism, drug abuse, child abuse were family matters, and they regarded it as being no business of the state to interfere. So don't poke your nose into that. They must have the night watchman state. The state was only there to intervene in the case of an emergency. A night watchman patrols the town at night, and he will raise the alarm if he sees a burglary in progress or sees a fire, ring his handbell, shout, there's a hue and cry. So the state must be minimal. It must do as little as possible and have people do as much as possible. Little battalion, said Edmund Burke. Like Thomas Jefferson said, he who governs best governs least. Anyway, so it was the consensus, and it was libertarian in some regards. On economic issues, the Whigs were there saying let's do as little as possible. Selling opium for recreation was regarded as an innocent, even an honourable occupation. It was done by the Honourable East India Company. So many politicians made fortunes out of selling these hard drugs, and they were licensed by the British government to sell opium in the British Isles and overseas. Remember Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an Opium Eater. The health and the good majority of the good of the majority were not sufficient reason to interfere. The state must back off. No nanny state. State inspectors were almost unheard of. I mean, it was said by A.J.P. Taylor that until the 19th century, the only time a person encountered the state was when he saw a policeman or a postman. In the 18th century, he would have seen only the postman. Parish constables. It was a major step when the police were set up in the 1830s. People thought it was just too much in some cases. The state is getting too mighty. So both parties had little time for taxation, for the purpose of the alleviation of poverty. They thought it was natural that some people should be impecunious. There was a parish rate, a tax on all property holders in the parish, differed from parish to parish, that funded workhouses to look after indigent orphans, single mothers, the infirm, the elderly. Conditions in these workhouses were deliberately kept very, very harsh. No one would throw themselves on the mercy of the workhouse unless they were absolutely had to. Less eligibility, make it less attractive to choose. It was masterly in action. If one helped the poor too much, then they would stop. They would claim handouts all the time. So you must improve the situation by not helping things. It's a bit like the Reverend Malthus's idea, read his essay on population. So you have to make going to the workhouse a less attractive option than working. So it's permissible to intervene on very few issues of public concern. Upholding morality was crucial. Christian morality, the Whigs would support that. Remember, no state pension, no minimum wage, no child benefit, no minimum age of labour, no compulsory schooling, no state funding for schooling, no unemployment benefit. Healthcare and education must be paid for by individuals. If your parents force you to work when you're 5, if you never get to go to a school for a single day, tough. That's your problem. That was the idea. If you're born disabled, too ill to work, that is your problem. That was more or less the attitude. There were charity hospitals provided for by donations and scholarships, but the provision was very uneven and very inadequate. Few could imagine a world in which it was much different. If you go back to the 18th century, the state wouldn't provide for these things that were too expensive, but they would provide for the army and navy. We mustn't have the state all powerful be catastrophic. People would lose their free will. That was a ludicrous argument, but the religious argument, oh, God doesn't cure diseases because they would have no free will. What? A bit like, okay, oh, medicine cures diseases, does that take away free will? No, it doesn't. So the Whigs believed that people were flawed and no one must become overmighty. Kings were useful because they keep politicians in check. But Whigs that the politicians, or indeed monarchs, mustn't have too much power because they might be tempted by tyranny. Searching houses, billeting soldiers in houses, and so on, these must be done only very sparingly because it could turn into tyranny. They opposed interrogation as a torture. The Whigs often spoke of doing things on behalf of the people, but Parliament represented the people, including most people who had no right to vote. But in political terms, the people, they meant property people, the nation. A bit like in Ireland, politicians talk about the nation, but that really only meant rich English-speaking Protestants, which was about 5% of the nation. Anyway, to acquire property, the right to trial by jury, habeas corpus, freedom of speech, some of these rights apply to everyone. Anyway, the Tories did not have such a corporate view of history. They tended to accept that history is chaotic and can't be squeezed and shouldn't be twisted to fit any preconceived notion. They didn't have some sort of format like Whigs for assuming how history was or should be. So they believed that history was like growing wild. I think the Tories were a bit more realistic on this one. So the Tories were more strongly influenced by the Christian notion of the fall of man, that we have sinned, we've rebelled against God, things have gone bad for us, and we simply have to accept we live in a fallen world that's very much flawed. So they believed that people were very imperfect and could never be perfected. So human nature has to be restricted because we have a propensity for wickedry, and firm laws must be backed up with very stiff penalties. Otherwise, it'll bring out the beast in people and we'd be very iniquitous. So the Tories were rather more open to persuasion, to the argument that civil liberty needed to be curtailed, or our rights need to be abridged in dire necessity, this in extremis argument. In wartime, they accepted that freedom of expression ought to be restricted. People could be flung into prison on the merest suspicion without charge nor trial. The property could be sequestered by the state and so forth. So they're more into the thorough, the strong state and the weak individual. So the Whigs were very much more doubtful about these things, but they did, in exigent circumstances, very loathily accept these things. Lord Chatham, or the elder is also known, this Whig Prime Minister, after he ceased to be Prime Minister, he said that necessity is the excuse of tyrants or the creed of slaves. But that didn't stop him when he was Prime Minister invoking these very same arguments. He was there during the War of Austrian Succession. The Tories regard themselves as more patriotic. The Whigs would say that they're less nationalistic, a bit more cosmopolitan. The Whigs, they sneered at the Tories as country bumpkins, as close-minded and insular. Of course, some people in the 18th century with the court party would support whoever really was in favour of the king, because the king had very extensive gifts of patronage. So the Tories regarded themselves as having a broader mind and more of a world view. So both parties accepted that some people were born to rule. The gentry were brought to be aldermen and members of parliament, and the lower orders should accept these people as their betters, gentle-folk. It was a mild form of neo-feudalism. The Marquess of Salisbury, this Conservative Prime Minister, as late as the 18th century, said that not everyone was born to learn to read. It might seem staggering today, but there we are. He wasn't a Whig, but it just tells you that even in the 1880s, someone saying that seems quite shocking today. There was a strong strain of anti-Catholicism in both parties. They saw that as antithetical to British national identity and to civil liberty in general, said that Catholic states are tyrannical. Now, that was sometimes true, but some of the Protestant German states were likewise. I remember in the late 18th century, there was a recruiting poster for the British Army saying, "Join the Royal Tars if you hate the French and damn the Pope." So there was national bigotry and anti-Catholicism there. So the Whig historians can be said to be a historical determinist. It assumes that history is a motive force, that there's a general trend. It's like this liberal idea now that there's an arc bending towards liberty. The Whigs favoured parliamentary government, and they retrospectively inserted their views into the minds of people who were dead a millennium before, claiming that there was this sort of parliamentary government in England, certainly in the 11th century. One thing about, say, Lord Macaulay going on about England and in English, he was half Scots, but there we are. Some people said England and English as a synecdoche, even though talking about the British Isles as a whole. So the Whigs were very judgmental. They insisted on these decided puerile divisions into goodies and baddies. So they were very much in the business of making moral pronouncements. They didn't believe in values-free history. It was vigorously partisan and emotional, so it can scarcely be regarded as objective, which surely is the very beginning of rational assessment of the past, is achieving detachment. Now, everyone's a little bit subjective, but they were really over-subjective. It was reductionist in claiming that there really are two sides to everything, and it can all be boiled down to parliamentary government. We must have reform, but not too much, because that would backfire, and we'd all go all the way back to tyranny, because people would fall for a frank liar, someone like Donald Trump. So it bases all views of past controversies on the present, and just insulting your disputants and saying you're like Julius Caesar or something. So it assumes inevitability, and it's a very unsound assumption. It's an evidenceless proposition. And it doesn't accept that things can happen for no good reason and can be chaotic. Their tidy minds, they want to place things in the correct spot. There's this cognitive weakness, I can't remember what it's called, where we go back over a memory and we try to order it, to make it neat, to make it fit and logical, and actually often it's not. It's a mess, and that's what reality is. So they're attempted to bend and massage the past to fit their predetermined prognostications, their forecast, their course of events. Like saying, this is the conclusion upon which I base my facts, when it should be the other way around. These are the facts upon which I base my conclusion. So that is the Whig view of history, and how it's really crossed over into modern liberal thinking. It's absolutely scintillating. It's perhaps too optimistic. Well, these days probably say too pessimistic, but to believe that things necessarily go towards progress. So there we are. Please subscribe to me and donate to me on PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com.